Welcome back, everyone, to another exciting edition of Pandemic Radio. On this week's edition, we'll be talking about environmental disasters. So sit back, relax, pop open a nice cold can of LaCroix, and enjoy this quick but exciting journey into the world of environmental disasters. So let's start off by defining what a disaster is. One of the key takeaways from this talk is going to be looking at the kind of different forms that disasters take and really looking at the distinction between something like a man made disaster, such as this classic meme, and a natural disaster. And I'll be making the argument, is there such a thing as a natural disaster anymore, a truly natural disaster? So, the United Nations defines disaster as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society causing widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses that exceed the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. Okay, and obviously, we've all experienced this in some form. Think of the wildfires in California, there are earthquakes, etc that we experience here in California, but disasters take different forms in different parts of the world, and obviously the environmental health consequences differ accordingly. So, when we're talking about the human health consequences as part of this definition, we need to look at a number of different things. Disasters can and do result in the loss of life, but this is not the only consequence that we think about. We need to also consider injuries that occur as a result of disasters, whether there are disease outbreaks that may occur following a disaster, or whether a disaster may disrupt health infrastructure in such a way that increases diseases that are otherwise kind of taken care of or well managed in a society. Uh, does the disaster disrupt the health infrastructure to the point where we get diseases where we would not have seen diseases otherwise? Damage to property obviously is a pretty common aspect of human health consequences. Destruction of assets kind of ties into this as well. So perhaps loss of a job, for example, following a disaster could be considered a loss of assets. Loss of services. This could be electrical, but even fundamental kind of water and sanitation services could have a pretty big effect on human health. Social and economic disruption, and then longer term environmental degradation. So does the disaster actually uh, negatively impact ecosystems to an extent that they will then in turn impact human health? So adding all this up obviously is going to look different for different disasters and in different civilizations. But when we add all this together, this is the measure of disaster impact. So when we talk about what is the impact of a particular natural disaster or environmental disaster, this is what we're talking about. So kind of adding up all of this stuff gives us an idea of the total impact of an environmental disaster. Risk is another kind of core concept here. Risk is what we talk about when we're thinking and measuring probability of an event. So, disaster risk is looking at the probability that something will happen or cause harm or injury. So, it's not the fact that it's not necessarily impact explicitly, but it's the probability that impact will be more or less in a certain area. And so, obviously, there's disaster mitigation plans that are put in place to reduce risk. So, think about all of the earthquake retrofitting that goes on in California, for example. So, all new buildings need to be built up to code, meaning they have to be able to withstand an earthquake of a certain magnitude. And then a lot of old structures like hospitals have to be retrofitted, meaning they have to go back and kind of upgrade them to be more like earthquake resilient. So these are all different examples of how we can reduce the risk of an environmental disaster like an earthquake, meaning that we're altering the probability that that natural event will cause harm or injury. So we're trying to adjust or alter the risk. Okay. And risk is really fundamentally based on context. So an earthquake is an earthquake, right? But an earthquake in one area where the community is able to offset or mitigate the risk is going to have a different impact than some other place where maybe the risk has not been altered. So we can have maybe the same magnitude earthquake resulting in different disaster impacts because risk was managed differently in those different areas. So this is kind of the core equation that we use when looking at the human health impacts of environmental disasters. We need to consider a few of these fundamental things. One is, what is the population's exposure to a particular environmental hazard? So this is kind of the human um, risk element. And then we need to look at how vulnerable this population is. So conditions of vulnerability could include things like socioeconomic status, etc. And then we need to look at the capacity to reduce or cope with negative consequences. So, an underlying theme to a lot of this, and in thinking of variables that can alter greatly this equation, are things like socioeconomic status. So, typically, you see um, environmental disasters having a greater impact on areas where the population is more vulnerable. Maybe the underlying infrastructure is not so great, and maybe they don't have the resources to cope with the negative consequences. So a lot of the impact and a lot of this equation is tied to socioeconomic status of a community. But also, it's largely affected by just where you apply this equation. So take this equation and apply it to any society in any location, and you're obviously going to be dealing with different underlying socioeconomic status. And you're also going to be dealing with different potential exposures to different disasters, right? So not everywhere in the world is equally exposed to like a volcano. Not everywhere in the world is equally exposed to an earthquake or a tornado, right? So this is really like situation specific and context dependent. And we apply this fairly basic and broad equation and outline to help us wrap our heads around what are the potential human health impacts of disasters. So, a few more kind of keywords before we start our little exploration into some case studies is looking at things like intrinsic and extrinsic risk. So, an extrinsic factor affecting risk is basically looking at the exposure and capacity of a community. And again, this is, I would argue, really spatially dependent on where we're talking about. So, what type of um, you know environmental disaster are we talking about? Is it a flood? Is it a hurricane? And then, what is the community's capacity to cope? Okay, so this is these are all these factors that are extrinsic, meaning they're kind of outside of the purview of the community, and that they're really dependent on the type of disaster and the community's capacity to cope. So this is kind of like outside the individual's kind of uh, I guess sphere of influence. Exposure, we define exposure as basically the amount of contact that someone has with the potential hazard. So, exposure to wind from tornadoes, exposure to water from floods go into this equation. Okay. So, think again of extrinsic risk factors as exposure plus capacity. Exposure is basically how much contact you have with hazard, a particular hazard. And then the capacity is like all the kind of combination of different resources that can be used to reduce the impacts of the exposure. So we're talking about economic resources. How much financial savings do you have? Do you have health insurance? What are some material resources that you have available to you? Are there shelters, stockpiles of medicine? Um, Does the community that you live in have emergency plans, for example? Do they have early warning systems set up to warn people about tsunamis? And then the socio-political resources, how much social support and political representation is there? So all of this basically defines and quantifies the social capacity to cope with a disaster. So when you add up this exposure variable plus this capacity variable, you get what are known as extrinsic factors. And extrinsic factors really define and describe and help us to understand why impacts are felt so differently depending on what and where disasters occur. So I kind of like this meme. I don't know. It was kind of funny, but I'm gonna go with it anyway. So hopefully it's not too much of a disaster. Okay, so a big part of reducing the extrinsic risk is with disaster plans, and what this makes me think of in today's day and age is pandemic plans. So different communities, even different like schools or different governments, have plans in place to help reduce extrinsic risk from like a pandemic. And that's something that we're obviously seeing now is, the global response is not equal to COVID-19, and a lot of this is because the extrinsic factors in different locations are quite varied. And a big part of that is, not everyone is equally prepared to deal with a pandemic. So those were the extrinsic risk factors, and now these are the intrinsic factors that affect risk. And intrinsic factors are those that are basically related to human vulnerability. So, what is the kind of demographic profile of a community? Generally, communities that have older populations tend to be at increased risk. What's the education and personal experience level? So, well educated communities, communities that offer a lot of training or preparation, tend to be better positioned to respond to disasters. Race, language, ethnicity, and even underlying health status all define intrinsic factors that affect disaster risk. So, a good example of this is when we see similar types of natural environmental disasters that have very, very different impacts. And this has to do with the extrinsic and intrinsic risk factors of that area. So, this is a tale of two storms. Hurricane Andrew happened way back in 1992, Florida. This was a powerful Category 5 storm that left damages estimated at over 26 billion with a B dollars. It resulted in 23 deaths, which is tragic, but when we consider a similarly kind of destructive, at least in terms of ecological force, storm was the tropical typhoon that impacted Bangladesh, a storm that was equivalent to the strength of Andrew, occurring in 1991, caused over 100,000 deaths and the subsequent displacement of millions of people from their homes. So basically, you see two storms with pretty similar ecological kind of strength, so wind speed, etc. And you look at the impact, 23 deaths versus over 100,000, and that is all due to these differences in extrinsic and intrinsic risk factors. So, when we talk about environmental disasters, probably the first kind of images that are conjured up in your minds, and we've already kind of talked about them a little bit here, are what are known as natural disasters. So, we talk about disasters in terms of whether they're like hydrometeorological. So, these have to do with droughts, wildfires, heat waves, storms like cyclones, tornadoes, windstorms, and flooding events. Geophysical disasters are those that involve earthquakes, landslides, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis. And biological natural disasters. Hey, look at that. Pandemics. We're experiencing one right now. Epidemics and other disease outbreaks. These are all different categories of natural environmental disasters. On the other hand, we have this interesting and growing and less, I think, understood series of environmental disasters called technological disasters. Technological disasters involve things like toxic waste events, nuclear accidents. So think about like Chernobyl, Fukushima, things like that. These are like the man-made disasters, and you can see that there's a lot more categories, and it's a lot different looking than the kind of natural disasters. But what I'm going to make the argument for um, right now is that most disasters that we see today are neither purely natural or purely technological. That when you have aspects of both, you get what are called hybrid disasters. And I would argue if we consider things like climate change to be an aspect of a technological disaster because it's man made, and we consider the fact that a lot of hurricanes and other natural disasters are made worse by things like climate change, do you really have purely natural disasters anymore? So I would make the argument that most disasters that we deal with as environmental health professionals are hybrid disasters in one way or another. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is the case study of the Fukushima nuclear plant disaster. This occurred and is an example, I think, a pretty good example of a hybrid disaster. And it happened with a natural event, which was an earthquake. An earthquake off the coast of Japan triggered a massive tsunami event. So basically, a giant wall of water, rippled through the ocean because of this massive earthquake, and caused a ton of damage along the coastline in Japan, including knocking out power to this nuclear power facility that was not designed to withstand the force of this tsunami. The result was basically an explosion and release of nuclear material. So you can see that this is a combination of purely natural disaster events like an earthquake with more technological, like the release of nuclear waste and the tsunami. When you add this all together, this is a good example of a hybrid disaster, and I would say infinitely more complex and potentially a larger impact than if it was just like an earthquake or maybe just a bad storm. This had like a lot of different elements, and obviously, because of that, it's a lot harder to prepare for, and the human health impacts tend to be a lot greater. So, again, hybrid disasters are those that draw from elements of both natural and technological. And I would argue that because climate change is driving a lot of the um, classically kind of categorized natural disasters like hurricanes and whatnot, and climate change is largely a, a response to technological human-made activities. That many of the disasters we see today are indeed hybrid disasters. And there are a lot of depictions of this kind of environmental health problem in things like cinema. Hollywood loves a good environmental disaster, and they seem to really love this concept of hybrid disasters. So that's why I'm kind of talking about movies now. And if you're able to join me this week for our special environmental health movie afternoon, we'll be exploring how hybrid disasters are depicted in cinema. So there's tons of examples, but the day after tomorrow is kind of a classic hybrid disaster, looking at these complex uh, intersection between technology and natural factors, and really kind of putting a Hollywood spin on the impact. Um, so again, just to kind of sum it up, the impact of a disaster, whether it's purely natural, technological, or some kind of hybrid, really depends on these three kind of broad categories. And remember, the disaster impact is not just human health, but a number of different things that we talked about earlier on. So again, the impact, the total impact of a disaster depends on how exposed a population is to a hazard, the conditions of vulnerability in the population. So how well is a community or a society or a group able to offset their potential exposure? So think about that photo that I just showed of the large wall of water kind of coming towards the coastal community. If you have a community with a higher socioeconomic status and can afford and has the resources to build an effective storm wall, you can offset your exposure to that potential hazard. And then the ability of the community to cope with the negative consequences afterwards. And just to kind of refresh what I'm talking about here, this really has to do with these extrinsic factors that define this risk. So exposure to the actual hazard itself. So that's like, think physical exposure to the water, physical exposure to actual wind from tornadoes, and then the capacity to basically you know become exposed to these things. And then again, the intrinsic factors that affect risk. A lot of this has to do with the inherent vulnerability of the population due to things like demographics and education level. There are natural disasters, technological disasters, and again, I would argue that moving forward as a future environmental health professional, we are increasingly in the realm of hybrid disasters. So I'm going to talk about a few of these as case studies now. So these are kind of the core concepts and terms that we need to kind of understand some of these classic environmental health um, disasters. The Chernobyl disaster. So this has come back into uh, kind of the collective conversation because of the HBO show Chernobyl. I don't know if any of you guys have seen it, but it's a pretty good and at times graphic depiction of the events in Soviet era, the USSR, back when Russia was the Soviet Union, and this really devastating nuclear technological disaster. So this is considered the world's greatest nuclear disaster. It occurred up in the Chernobyl area, the Chernobyl region, what is now Ukraine, up by the border of Russia, and it was the only actual accident in the history of nuclear power where radiation-related fatalities occurred as there was direct result of exposure to released radioactive material. So essentially, what happened here is the nuclear reactor in the Chernobyl power plant was there was a flaw in the design. So it had a flawed design which resulted in basically an explosion, and the explosion resulted in a core meltdown. And what that means is nuclear power is basically fundamentally a rather simple process with a lot of very, very complicated science behind it. And essentially, what you have is using radioactive rods. I mean, picture like just like these kind of metal poles that are radioactive, and they're so hot, because they're, radioactive material, they produce a ton of heat. And when you basically expose them to water, they vaporize the water, turn it into steam, and then that steam uh, turns turbines, and that turbine spinning generates electricity. So that's essentially how nuclear power works. And this is actually okay because the nuclear rods that are so hot can actually be kept safe if they're kept cool and kept in like basically these giant swimming pools. But if you have something like an explosion that kind of knocks all this careful balance out of whack, the rods are left out in the elements and they basically become too hot and can explode. So, the subsequent release of radioactive material resulted in acute radiation syndrome, or ARS, that was diagnosed in 237 people. So, this is different than like the long term kind of cancer effects that maybe you think of when you think of radiation poisoning. This is direct, immediate radiation poisoning that can be very fatal very quickly, not the long term kind of cancer implications. So, most of the radioactive material that was released into the atmosphere because of the explosion dusted nearby communities with this kind of debris and radioactive material kind of dust. The lighter material was able to be carried up by wind over parts of Eastern Europe, and this radioactive material it ends up being what causes the greatest human health impact. So, radioactive isotopes, which is just a kind of byproduct of the process, including radioactive iodine, the main issue there is it can accumulate in your thyroid, causing cancer and leading to early death. The Chernobyl explosion resulted in a few kind of immediate deaths just from the force of the blast, the initial explosion, and then 29 deaths from acute radiation sickness. But the World Health Organization estimates that over 5,000 cancer deaths were related to this accident because of things like radioactive iodine being accumulated in thyroid in people's thyroids. And I would think that probably that number is a conservative estimate and probably quite a bit higher. So when thinking about, well, how do we kind of classify this as a disaster, I would suggest that this is an example of a technological disaster involving radioactive material. And the main kind of hazard or exposure here is with this radioactive isotopes. And the problem with radioactive isotopes, other than causing acute radiation sickness and then leading to long term cancer, is the fact that this material stays around for a really long time. So that's measured with something called the half life. And the half life basically means how long it takes for the radioactive material to be half as strong, half as toxic, half as kind of dangerous. So when you have something with a half life of 1 year, that means that it takes 1 year for that element to break down enough to be half as strong or dangerous as it was. And you can see all the different types of radioactive isotopes that were released as a result of the Chernobyl disaster, ranging from neptunium, and not to make too light of this, but a lot of these names are kind of fun, right? Neptunium has a half life of 58 hours. This was released during the accident. But what's troubling is some of these isotopes with really, really long half lives. So look at plutonium 240 and 239. Half lives of 6,850 years and over 24,000 years, meaning it takes 24,000 years for plutonium 239 to be just half as dangerous as it is today. Okay. So, what do you do when you have an area that has been blanketed with plutonium 239? And you know that it's basically going to be dangerous for the next 24,000 years. That resulted in over 400 times more radioactive fallout than the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. So this was a massive release and dose of radioactive material. And the result is something called the exclusion zone. And this has to do with the fact that those isotopes are basically have been deposited in the environment around the area. And when you have radioactive isotopes with half lives of over 20,000 years, that basically means that this is a no go zone for humans for the next 20,000 years. So this is now a chunk of the earth that humans can no longer go to because it's too dangerous. And it's going to be dangerous for 20,000 years. People used to live here, and now they don't anymore. They can't because it's too dangerous. So this displaced over 130,000 people in this 1,000 square mile exclusion zone, um, which will not be safe to be occupied by people again for 20,000 years. So I hope they grabbed everything that they needed because they're not going back, right? Just a kind of interesting, hang on. Snapple fact is a cottage industry of tourist companies have sprung up around this, basically offering tours. You can actually go take a tour inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone. So, would this be something you'd be into? Would you go pay money to go be guided around inside this Chernobyl exclusion zone? Think about that for a second. Just gonna take a sip of my coconut LaCroix. That's refreshing. So I've thought about this and I'm a little intrigued, I'm not gonna lie, because you get to see stuff like this. This is what it looks like when you have a community that is forced to leave and evacuate immediately. And you see here all of the remnant, basically gas masks that were distributed to try to help people so they wouldn't be breathing in this radioactive material. And you see basically this whole city that is just very eerily abandoned, just like overnight. And now, because it's an exclusion zone and no one can go there, it's just kind of slowly decaying. You can see things like the amusement parks, the town where the forest is now regrowing, old amusement parks, and the forest has kind of overtaken what was a pretty busy city. Um, there has been a lot of like urban mythology that has sprung up around this. Are what happens basically when you blanket an entire city with radioactive material? Does it like cause mutated monsters, and is it like this kind of real life horror movie? Actually, kind of the opposite. And we're kind of seeing this now with the COVID pandemic, right? Like when you have people sheltered in place, when you have people, not moving around as much, nature and wildlife is actually able to kind of bounce back a little bit. So because this exclusion zone, everyone just had to like vanish overnight, basically. Wildlife and ecosystems are actually bouncing back and thriving as a result of this. So a lot of endangered animals and species are actually kind of making a comeback, which is interesting. So these are camera traps, and camera traps are basically cameras mounted with like motion detectors, where if something goes by, it'll snap a photo. And so these are motion detector images taken inside the exclusion zone, showing a lot of animal species making a comeback, including a lot of endangered animals. Um, let's see if I can get this to work. Uh, so I'm gonna post this on the internet or on the website if I can get it to work. But it's basically, if you have seen this series, it's called Our Planet. It's on Netflix. Season 1, episode 8. 40 minutes in, they do a really cool job of showing you this sort of bouncing back of ecosystems within inside the exclusion zone. So I'll try to post it if I can't. Go check that out. It's pretty interesting. There's also some good documentary material if you're looking for something to watch while sheltering in place. So what do you do with this power plant that's basically exploded and is going to be radioactive and be dangerous for the next 20,000 years? Like, what do you do? Well, this is what they did. basically you just build a giant shell around it that keeps all the radioactive stuff inside. And you basically just build this giant shell that's meant to last for thousands of years. And that's the solution. That's it. That's what they could do. So let's see if I can get this to work. Great. So I'm going to post this to the website. I would, encourage you guys to check it out. It's really interesting. It shows the process of them building this giant like containment thing. So why am I, talking about all this? Well, remember when I mentioned the different elements that go into like evaluating the impact of a disaster? One of those was like, how does a community respond after the fact? And this shows you like how complex some of these natural and man-made disasters are, because not only is it just like the fact that everyone had to leave the exclusion zone, like what do you do with a radioactive power plant that's just sitting there? They had to build this massive containment structure to deal with this. So it shows you like how complex and how kind of unique these challenges can be. So again, you can actually go check this out. You can go get a Geiger counter. You can go tour inside the exclusion zone. Check out ChernobylTour.com. I don't know if that's a reputable company or not, but there is like this industry, and there's a lot of tourists. They're called dark tourists, and I think there's also a show on Netflix called Dark Tourists, where you can learn a little bit more about this. And I'll post this as well. This is a quick tour inside the exclusion zone. Oh, even ads even in the pandemic. Okay, so I'll post that stuff to the website, so check it out. The second disaster, and this is a classic one. This is one that I learned about in grad school. If you're going to be taking an environmental health class in the future, you've probably heard of Love Canal. Love Canal is another example of a technological disaster that basically resulted in these like toxic waste dumps being buried underneath a community. There was a chemical company in the 1940s and 1950s that used a local canal in this was in the Northeast around New York. They basically used this canal as a chemical waste dump. So they were polluting intentionally these streams. And after they were done, they basically like said, okay, well, we've dumped a bunch of hazardous waste material into this canal area. So we'll just kind of bury it, and we'll just put clay on it, and we'll just, say, okay, now it's a landfill, right? It's kind of like sweeping the mess under a rug. This hazardous waste contained a lot of hazardous chemicals, including dozens of known carcinogens, meaning chemicals that can cause cancer. This property was, I would say, not super idyllic. They actually sold this property, which was basically just sitting on top of now a giant hazardous waste site, to the Niagara Falls School Board. Guess how much this property went for? Ready? $1. Yep. Pretty shocking. So this is if you've ever wondered, well, what do they do with a dump when it's like, or a landfill when it's all full? Like, where does our trash go? Basically, it's a lot more complicated than just like covering it with dirt. There's a whole series of like inner liners and like drainage systems, and there's a quite a bit that actually goes into like a well-designed, properly maintained landfill site. And it has to do in large part to keep all the potentially toxic chemicals from leaching out into the water system and back into the communities, keeping all this stuff in one place. But with Love Canal, this wasn't the case. And because this land was sold to the Niagara Falls School Board, they do what school boards do. They built a school. And in 1955, this elementary school was built directly over the chemical landfill. Well, fast forward a few years, and I think you can kind of guess what was going to happen. In the 1970s, a series of inexplicable illnesses began to appear, including in the community cases of epilepsy, asthma, a series of migraines, and other kind of birth defects, and including, and this is a really shocking kind of statistic, the rate of miscarriages increased by over 300%, and the rate of birth defects just from 1974 to 1978 increased by 56%. So 56% of children born during this little period of time were born with birth defects of some kind. So obviously something's going on here. This is a pretty clear and dramatic example of the human health impacts. Um, and at the time, uh, it wasn't thought that, well, maybe we're kind of building these schools or living on top of this toxic landfill. There was an interesting aspect of this that had to do with the local environment that, again, was related to the extrinsic risk factor of this area, extrinsic, because it had to do with the geological location of where this occurred. And part of this was that this toxic waste dump was built actually below the water table. So when it rained a lot, basically it would overflow and it would kind of spill over. And so the chemicals within the landfill actually basically like leached into the community water and soil. And this kind of gross toxic leach is called leachate, and you can see a photo of that there on the right. And that basically occurred because, like, imagine the water table. You can see down there on the image to the left. If that groundwater table, if that water level raises up into the leachate, you can see why that would be such a problem. And that's it thought to explain why the community was suffering from these health consequences. So the local community started protesting and saying, "Hey, we're getting sick. This isn't right. Why were we not warned, or why were we not told that we're living on top of this toxic waste dump?" And initially, the officials in local government were dismissive, and these are protest signs from that time. Um, until in 1978, the president of the United States, his name was Jimmy Carter, a little history lesson for us today, declared an emergency. They basically said, this place is contaminated. We need to get you guys out of there. So they ended up relocating 239 families, and they left, over 700 families left behind to basically clear out and say, hey, you can't live here anymore. And then in 1981, they declared a second emergency to get the remaining families out. So you can see, like, the satellite photos of then and now, where the community was, and then they had to clear everything out because basically, again, they were sitting on top of a toxic waste dump. So the legacy of the Love Canal, while it was in and of itself troubling, and the health impacts were troubling, it left a really long legacy, and really kind of became the symbol of this of an environmental disaster that was representative of a larger problem in the United States and around the world, which is, well, that wasn't the only toxic waste disposal site in the United States. There's actually a ton of them all over the place. What do we do about that? We don't want more love canals, right? So what do we do? In 1980, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, aka Superfund, was formed. And the Superfund, which is way funner and easier to say than the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980, basically what this did was set aside money to help communities respond to and mitigate the health impacts of these toxic waste disposal sites. And really, this symbolized the beginning of the grassroots environmental justice movement. Environmental justice basically deals with the disproportionate impact of toxic pollution on working class and minority communities. Okay. So in Love Canal, that land was sold for cheap and perhaps was only affordable for low income families in that area. So it was disproportionately affecting low income families. That is an example of an environmental justice issue. So the Superfund is going on today. It still exists, and it is a big legacy. And I hope everyone got a little chuckle out of this. Get it? Superfund? Okay. So the Superfund is run by the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and you can see, signs like this. Well, what does that mean? Superfund. That sounds kind of fun. Well, now you can tell all your friends, "Hey, don't go in there. That's a Superfund site." So again, the Superfund is a set of resources set aside that allows the Environmental Protection Agency to clean up contaminated waste disposal sites. It also holds uh, the organizations that were responsible for polluting the areas. It holds them accountable, meaning that they either have to pay for the cleanup or they have to reimburse the government to pay for the cleanup. And so the overall goals of the Superfund are to protect human and environmental health by, cleaning up this mess or these messes, making people pay for it that were responsible for it, and importantly, involving the local communities in this process. So making sure it's more transparent and that everyone has buy-in. The idea is that you want to return a Superfund site to productive and safe use. You can go online and check out if you live near a Superfund, because isn't that kind of fun? This is a map of Superfund sites across the United States, and including in California, you see quite a few, and in the Bay Area. So isn't that kind of fun? Alrighty, on to Africanized bees. You guys still doing good? Hanging in there? Well, hey, you can always push pause and take a little break. Go get yourself another tasty LaCroix. On to Africanized bees. So you guys have maybe heard of this. I know when I was a whippersnapper back in the day, this was a big deal for my friends and I. Like, especially I remember in elementary school, way back in the day. This was in the early 1990s. Um, I remember hearing a lot about this thing called killer bees, and in the news, oh, the killer bees are coming. The killer bees are coming. Kind of sounds like a horror movie. Killer bees are an example, I think, of a complex hybrid disaster, and one that maybe isn't talked about as much in environmental health classes like Chernobyl or the Love Canal story, but I think is an interesting example of how complex a hybrid disaster can be. So the so-called killer bees are actually Africanized honeybees, which are a hybrid between European and African bee species. What makes them different and what makes them dangerous is they are a particularly aggressive uh, species of honeybee. And whereas most bees, like, they don't really want to go pick a fight, like they don't want to mess with you. They just kind of want to go about their bee business and do their thing. Um, these guys can actually and have been known to attack unprovoked. Actually, they're considered very, very aggressive. And not only do they attack when unprovoked, but they don't respond just one at a time. The whole gang goes after. The whole hive will go and will respond in large numbers. And if you take someone, especially who's sensitive to bee stings, that can be deadly and has been deadly. So this was an example of a bee that was they're called biological invasions, when basically you have like an insect species unintentionally released and then kind of spreading through a new habitat. The African honeybee was released inadvertently in Brazil in the 1950s, and then you can see over the next couple of decades, spread pretty quickly and made it into the United States in the 1990s. So this was back when I was in Southern California in elementary school. I was hearing about the African honeybees are coming. The African honeybees are coming. The killer bees are coming. And I remember like all of my friends and I, every time we would see like a bee on the playground, we'd all, get all freaked out and say, "Oh my gosh, it's the killer bees." So isn't that kind of a fun little Dr. Bale's history lesson? Okay, so again, what makes the Africanized honeybees such a danger? Because you're thinking, well, hey, we've learned about ecosystem services, and bees provide a really important ecosystem service. They're pollinators, right? Um, well, the Africanized honeybees, true, are pollinators because they're bees, but again, they are characterized by frequent swarming. They establish new nests in this really aggressive way by basically all swarming to new locations. They have this ability, they're very hardy, so they can survive on sparse supplies of pollen and nectar, meaning they can survive in, arid environments, or they're, able to spread into new and different territories. Um, when food does become scarce in a certain area, they can basically pick up and move very quickly, and they're able to spread very quickly because they can exploit new habitats very quickly and basically move in and take over. They're extremely aggressive and highly defensive in nature, and they result in more bee stings when they are provoked. Uh, what's kind of scary about this is that they can sense people or animals more than 50 feet away from their nests, and they can actually like sense vibrations and movement, um, as far as over 100 feet away. Um, so they can kind of feel you and hear you coming if you're like a quarter of a mile away, and they might think you're a threat and an enemy and start actually going after you. So this is where Africanized bees are and where they are going. And you can see they made their way up through Mexico from Brazil and have kind of infiltrated the southern parts of the United States and up into the middle part of California into the mid 2000s. Since introduced in Brazil, Africanized or killer bees have killed over 1,000 people. These victims receive as many as 10 times as many stings than like a normal European strain of honeybee. Um, and why this becomes kind of this complex hybrid disaster is the larger effect that it's had on agriculture and industries like that. Um, Typically, you see, if you've ever driven down the Central California, like Central Valley, and you're driving through that freeway corridor during a certain time of year, like when there's flowers on all the almond trees, for example, companies will actually ship in these bee boxes, these white boxes containing bees to go pollinate their crops. Um, Africanized honeybees don't make good bee species for this approach because they're difficult to manage and transport. So they don't make good like commercial pollinators. And so, because they can kind of force their way in, they take over where local maybe bees were, and they kind of can wreak havoc on the local agricultural industry. Okay, something a little more current and maybe I guess um, infamous. Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina is, as the name implies, a hurricane, which is a natural disaster. But I would again argue that Hurricane Katrina is more an example of a hybrid disaster than you might think. So in 2005, the Gulf Coast of the United States was struck by a massive, over 400-mile across hurricane that was categorized as level 3, meaning sustained winds of over 100 to 140 miles per hour. The storm itself did a lot of damage. The flooding, winds, etc., did damage and caused, a significant toll on human health. But where this starts to become a hybrid complex disaster was the aftermath. In New Orleans, in particular, the devastation was widespread and pretty dramatic. So these are images following the Hurricane Katrina landfall. You can see downtown New Orleans people riding boats to try to get through. Um, Large, wide scale flooding. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, more than $100 billion in damage, and 2,000 people killed as a result of this. This has to do with the intrinsic and extrinsic factors of the area. So, if you've ever been to New Orleans, really cool city, I would definitely recommend it. Great food, cool music, but a lot of it is technically under sea level. So, you can see that most of the city is actually like at or below sea level. The average elevation of this city is actually 6 feet below sea level, so like minus 6 feet, and it is completely surrounded by water. The Army Corps of Engineers built a series of levees and seawalls to basically respond to this, basically prevent the city from flooding. So it's surrounded by water. It's technically underwater. So if it does flood, where's water going to flow? It's going to flow down. So it's going to flow into the city. So you can see here a giant storm wall essentially protecting this community from the water. And this results in a lot of vulnerability, neighborhoods that are below sea level. And you can see here a really cool GIS map. Yep. Showing where vulnerability was highest because not only are they below sea level, but they're amongst the city's poorest and most vulnerable populations. In fact, in this city of 500,000 people, over 100,000 did not have access to a car. So you could say, well, the hurricane was coming, people can just like get up and leave, but that's not always so simple. When Hurricane Katrina made landfall, the levees and flood walls that were designed to protect the population, particularly the vulnerable population, were breached in more than 50 different locations. So basically, they broke apart, and the resulting flooding was widespread and catastrophic. And you can see that with these before and after satellite images. Over 80% of the city was under some kind of water during this. So you can see before and after just the complete devastation and how much widespread flooding there was. And a lot of this was due to the fact that it was a huge storm, but also all of these seawalls and levees failed. And the human health impact was tremendous. You saw a lot of people stranded on buildings. They couldn't escape and basically had to wait around to get rescued. And it became so dire that they would have to like write messages on top of buildings when they were stranded. Another interesting aspect of the city is that because the city is beneath sea level, you have cemeteries that are not able to put coffins and burials underground because of this fact. So a lot of the cemeteries in the city are actually above ground. And when you have a flooding event like this, the result was pretty gruesome, and a lot of caskets and things like that were um, displaced and moved and exposed. Part of the massive response effort included going door to door, rescuers going door to door and looking for survivors, looking for people that maybe needed help, looking for people who didn't survive to try to kind of collect things. And you saw this interesting kind of symbology start to occur. It looks like kind of this graffiti tagging, but it's actually part of the response effort. And you see these what look like X's with some information kind of scribbled around on it. And here's an example of a rescue crew marking one of these buildings. So every time a building was searched by a rescue group, it received one of these marks. These became known as the X codes. So the X codes can be deciphered by this. The code on the left identifies the particular rescue team that searched that building. The number at the bottom was the number of live and dead victims found in the structure. So how many dead, how many alive, or if it was vacant, they put a 0. Any hazards that are present. So for example, This one says NE at the bottom, so they did not make entry. Was there any other kind of hazards? Even like floating rats, for example. And then the date at the top where and or when the structure was searched. So the when remember when we talk about quantifying the human health impacts of natural and environmental and hybrid disasters, um, part of that equation goes into how prepared and how capable of mounting a good response. And in this case, the federal government was really criticized for not being prepared and not responding effectively to the aftermath. So making what was a really bad hurricane into this really catastrophic disaster event. In fact, they were so desperate for some kind of solution. All these people that needed to become evacuated. This was the Superdome. Their football stadium was turned into a temporary relief shelter that housed 30,000 evacuees on cots. You also have this socioeconomic conditions that really altered and affected the exposure to these hazards. So the intrinsic risk factors in New Orleans included 30% of the people living at the poverty level. And because a disaster like Katrina can really exacerbate these conditions, many of the poorest citizens in the community were left even more vulnerable than they had been before the storm. And you can see the basically amount of flooding in the lower ninth ward. So you see the map there on the right. The lower ninth ward also received the most flooding. So the poorest communities were the hardest hit. Okay, on to the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. Haiti is a lower socioeconomic, what would be called developing or global south country. It is considered the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, experiencing bouts of political instability and underlying health conditions such as HIV, making it a particularly vulnerable population to disaster. So, when you have a country experiencing widespread poverty, a lot of political corruption, low education levels, this spells a community that is particularly vulnerable to natural disasters. And in 2010, that's what happened. A magnitude 7.0 earthquake hit just outside of the capital city of Port au Prince. This was the strongest earthquake in the area in over 200 years. This earthquake killed over 300,000 people and left 1.5 million people in this small country homeless. The devastation was widespread and spared even the or affected even the vulnerable communities. So the so-called informal settlements, or what are some called slums, sometimes called slums, to even the presidential palace. So imagine like the White House crumbling like this. It was really a widespread catastrophic event. So why was it so destructive? Well, it was a very strong earthquake, but it earthquakes happen beneath the ground, and this particular earthquake happened at a relatively shallow distance below the surface. The epicenter again was near the capital city, Port-au-Prince, which had over 2 million people. And a lot of the buildings were not built to code, so these were not retrofitted buildings meant to withstand a really strong earthquake. Because poverty was so high, a lot of these buildings were kind of shabbily built. The result was because we had over 1.5 million people left homeless. We had the creation of what are called IDP camps, or internally displaced person camps, meaning these are Haitian citizens that are essentially displaced within their own country. So you add to what is already a really bad situation, you have an even worse situation when all of a sudden a cholera outbreak occurs. So in these gigantic internally displaced person camps, you have conditions that are ripe for infectious disease outbreaks. And that's what happened in October of 2010. Cholera, an infectious disease spread by contaminated food and water, caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, spread. It is believed to have come from a United Nations camp hosting peacekeepers that were there to, help with the situation. It's thought that some peacekeepers from Nepal brought the bacteria, and then it started spreading. Because sanitation and things like that were not so good in these areas, and the result was the largest cholera outbreak in modern times. 8% of the entire population was affected, resulting in almost 10,000 or more deaths and 770,000 cases of cholera illness. Growingly, the scientific consensus was that as part of the response effort, the United Nations was held accountable, that this outbreak was probably started by one or very few infected asymptomatic individuals, and possibly even one. One sick person could have been spreading all of this. Ultimately, the United Nations ended up taking responsibility. And I think another kind of good example, or I shouldn't say good, but a strong example of the complexity of hybrid disasters. So, an earthquake in and of itself is a natural event, but you can see that a lot of the human impact was a result of human factors, technological factors. So, I would argue again another strong example of a hybrid disaster. So, this has been your kind of brief introduction to the world of environmental disasters. I think it's obviously, and it's an important module, an important topic. You can get a PhD in disaster, environmental health, and we're just scratching the surface. But obviously, if you're interested in environmental health, if you're interested in making a difference, if you're interested in job security, this might be for you. It has a lot of moving parts to it. Disasters are complex, and especially the hybrid disasters of the future are more and more going to be linked to things like climate change. So that's it for disasters, and hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys got through it with your LaCroix in hand. Until next time, this is Dr. Bales signing off.